Hello everybody, this is Bassem with JanusGraph, and in this video I'm going to show you how to host multiple graphs on the same instance of JanusGraph. I'll start by showing you how to add graphs by editing the configuration file, and this approach does require a JanusGraph server restart. And then I'll show you how to use the ConfiguredGraphFactory to dynamically add and drop graphs without having to restart the JanusGraph server. So let's start by looking at the default JanusGraph configuration. Out of the box, JanusGraph is configured to host only one graph, and this one graph uses the in-memory storage backend. So let's look at this default configuration, and hopefully it will help us determine what we need to change to add other graphs. So I'll first switch to the Janus user, which is the user I use to manage the JanusGraph files and run the JanusGraph server. And then I'll navigate to the JanusGraph root folder. And under the JanusGraph root folder, I'll go to the conf folder and then Gremlin server folder. And this is the YAML configuration file that's used to configure the server. So I open this file. And this is the most important part of the file. It has a list of graphs. And the default configuration has only one item, one graph item. This graph, the key graph, this is also the identifier that's used by clients to access the graph object. And the value here, this is a path to a properties file that specifies some information about this graph. For example, which storage backend should be used for this graph and which mixed index backend, and maybe other things like the name of the table in the storage backend where this graph data will be saved. So that's the YAML file. Another file we want to look at, again, I'll switch to the Janus user and I'll go to the JanusGraph root folder. This time I want to go to the scripts folder under the JanusGraph root folder. And under the scripts folder, you have this Groovy script, empty sample.groovy. So let's open this and see its contents. You will see that this Groovy script defines a global's hash map. And the very last line, it adds a key value pair to this hash map. The key is G and the value is the graph traversal source. So G is the identifier that can be used by clients to access the graph traversal source. So we have two identifiers for the client. We have the graph identifier, which can be used to access the graph object, and the G identifier, which can be used to access the graph traversal source. So let's try starting the JanusGraph server and see if we can use these identifiers from a client. Okay, and I'll run this shell script under the bin folder to start the Gremlin server. And the Gremlin server was started successfully, and it is now listening to port 8182. Let's now run the Gremlin console and try to connect to this server. Before I do that, I want to name these tabs because we have too many of them. This one is JanusGraph server, and new tab will be for the Gremlin client. And I will run gremlin.sh to start the Gremlin console. First thing I'll do, I'll connect the Gremlin console to the server. So I'll say remote connect. linkerpub.server, and the configuration file is conf/remote.yaml. Then I'll say remote console to send all the following commands to the server. And now I want to try using the graph identifier, see if it does point to the graph object, and it does. Perfect. It's a graph, standard JanusGraph that uses the in-memory storage backend. Okay, the other identifier I want to try is the G identifier. This one points to the graph traversal source. Perfect, so it is working as expected. So now we know that to add another graph, we need to add another graph item to the YAML configuration file. And we need to add another key value pair to the globals hash map in the Groovy script. Okay, so before we add this graph item, we need to have a properties file for our new graph. So let's create this now. I'll open another tab for that. Okay, so these are the properties files property files that come with JanusGraph. We want our new graph to use HBase as its storage backend. So I will copy this file, janusgraph-hbase.properties, and I will name my new properties file. Let's call it graph2, because the new graph will be called graph2-hbase.properties. So that's the file we just created. Let's open it for editing. And because I copied an HBase file, so we have the storage backend set to HBase, and the storage host name is set to the loopback address. That's perfect. Both the JanusGraph server and the HBase server will be running on the same machine. We have a few caching properties. There is only one property that I want to set. I want to set the name of the HBase table where the graph data will be stored. And I don't remember the property name, so I will go to the JanusGraph documentation. Under JanusGraph basics, we have configuration reference, storage.hbase, and here is the name of the property I wanted, storage.hbase.table. So I'll copy that and I'll paste it here. And the value will be, let's call the table graph2. Okay, and I'll write this and quit. So now we have our properties file. Now let's make the YAML file. Let's add a graph to the YAML file and make it use this properties file. So the other graph will be called graph2. And remember that this is the identifier that will be used by the clients to access the graph object. And the path to the properties file will be conf/, that's the properties file we just created. Okay. So we'll have a graph with an identifier graph2, and it will use the properties file that we just created that will instruct JanusGraph to use HBase as the storage backend for this graph. Okay, that's the only thing I wanted to do to the YAML file. Now for the Groovy script, we will use the Groovy script to expose an identifier for the graph traversal source for this graph2. So let's edit this Groovy script. I'll copy this line. We will add another key value pair to the globals hash map. This time the key will be called G2. and the value will be the graph2 traversal source. And remember, G2 is the identifier that will be used by clients to access the graph traversal source of this graph2. Okay, now I'll write this. So this is the only changes to the configuration of JanusGraph that we need to make. My HBase server is not running right now, so I'll need to start it. So I switch to the HBase user. This is the user I used to run the HBase server. And then I'll go to the HBase root folder, then to the bin folder, and I'll run start hbase.sh to start the HBase server. Now I want to start the HBase shell so we can see the tables that are being created by JanusGraph. So I'll run HBase with the command line argument shell. And the shell was started successfully. Now let's run the list commands to see what tables we have initially. And I don't have any tables right now in HBase. Okay, perfect. Now we changed the JanusGraph configuration. So to apply this new configuration, we need to restart the JanusGraph server. So what I'll do Control-C on my keyboard to shut down the server. Then I'll clear the screen, and let's start the server again, which should apply the new configuration. And it will take some time to start this time because it's creating the graph2 in HBase, creating the graph2 table in HBase. So it will take more than usual to start. And it finally started successfully, and it's now listening to 8182. Okay, since we restarted the server, we need to close the connection in our Gremlin client and reconnect to the server because we restarted it. So I'll do remote close, and I'll do the remote connect again, and remote console to send the following commands to the server. And now what we want to test, we want to make sure that we can use the graph2 identifier to access the new graph object. And yes, it is working. It's standard JanusGraph that uses HBase as its storage backend. And here is the address of the HBase server. Perfect. So the graph2 identifier is working. Now let's try the G2 identifier from the Groovy script. This one should point to the graph traversal source, and it is working indeed. Okay, so we created the graph from the configuration, and we made the identifiers graph2 and G2 available to the client to be able to access the graph object and the graph traversal source object. So it did work perfectly, but I should note that we had to restart the server to make it add the new graph. This may be acceptable or not acceptable depending on your use case. If you want to be adding and dropping graphs frequently and you do not want to interrupt the service every time you do that, then I think this approach will not work for you, will not be ideal for you. You don't want to stop the server and start it again every time you add or remove a graph. So to avoid having to restart the server, you can use the ConfiguredGraphFactory. And the ConfiguredGraphFactory, it's a class that allows you to dynamically add and drop graphs without having to restart the server. And the default JanusGraph configuration, it doesn't allow you to use the ConfiguredGraphFactory. We need to make some changes to the configuration to be able to do that. And I'll show you right now what changes you need to make to the configuration. So first thing, we will need to make some changes. Oh, before the YAML file, we need to create a properties file for the configuration management graph, because this configured graph factory, it uses a configuration management graph, which is like a metadata graph that contains information about the other graphs that are managed by the configured graph factory. Like if you're familiar with SQL Server, it's something like the master database in SQL Server. It's a database containing information about other databases, and it's used by the database server to manage the other databases or track the other databases or graphs. So that's the function of the configuration management graph. And it needs to be stored somewhere, right? It's a graph after all, and it needs to be stored somewhere. I already have an HBase server running here, so it makes sense for me to store this configuration management graph in HBase. So I will create a properties file that instructs JanusGraph to store the configuration management graph in HBase. And we already have a couple of properties files for the configuration management graph. I have these files right here, JanusGraph-Cassandra-configuration-graph.properties. This is a properties file for storing the configuration management graph in Cassandra using the thrift driver. And we have another properties file for storing the configuration graph in Cassandra using the CQL driver. So you can use those if you're using Cassandra, but in my case I'm using HBase, and there is no such a properties file for HBase, so I'll need to create one. And I will create it by copying the CQL file, and I will name the new file JanusGraph-HBase-configuration-graph.properties. So this is the new file that we just created. I'll open it for editing. Okay, so since we copied the Cassandra file, so it sets the storage backend to CQL, I want to change this. I want to set it to HBase instead. It also says that the graph name will be configuration management graph. That's good, it works for me. And the host name for the storage backend will be the loopback address. In our case, both the HBase server and the JanusGraph server will be running on the same machine, so that's good. I'll keep this. And there are a few other caching properties. So that's the only change I needed to make. I needed to change the storage backend from CQL to HBase. Now I'll write this and quit. And we have this properties file that will instruct, or that will tell JanusGraph about the configuration for the configuration management graph. Okay, so I need now to make some changes to this YAML file, and I don't remember the exact code I need to write here, so I'll go to the JanusGraph configuration, and I'll go to this article under the JanusGraph basics. I'll go to ConfiguredGraphFactory. This will tell you what changes you need to make to your YAML file to use the ConfiguredGraphFactory. So we need to add a graph manager. I'll copy this from here. And I will add it here. That's my graph manager. You set it to this class, the JanusGraph manager class. And also the documentation says that we need to have a graph item, which key is configuration management graph. And the value will be the properties file that says where this configuration management graph should be saved. Okay, so the path should be the path to the properties file we just created. I'll copy that. Okay, and this is the path to the properties file. Okay, there is a third change that needs to be made to the YAML file. And I'll copy some more code from the JanusGraph documentation. So we need to change the value. We already have a channelizer property here, but we need to change its value. This will be the new channelizer value. So we're replacing the standard Apache Tinkerpop channelizer with a JanusGraph channelizer. So this will be our new value. And the reason we need this channelizer is because this is what will make the graph traversal source identifier available to the clients. So the clients can use a graph traversal source for the graphs that we create dynamically using the configured graph factory. So these are the only three changes I needed to make. I needed to change the value of the channelizer. I needed to add a graph manager, and I needed to add a graph with the key configuration management graph. Okay, so now I'll save the YAML configuration file. And now this is the only change to the configuration that we needed to make. So to apply this new configuration, I will shut down the server by pressing Ctrl+C. And then I will start the server again to apply the new configuration. And it will create the configuration management graph in HBase, so it will take some time to start. Okay, it started successfully and it's now listening to port 8182. Let's see the tables in HBase. So now we have two tables. We have the graph2 table. This is for the graph that we created from the configuration. This graph2 right here. And we also have the configuration management graph. This is the metadata graph that will be used by the ConfiguredGraphFactory to track the databases. Okay, perfect. So now we have JanusGraph running, and it's now it should make it possible for the client to use the ConfiguredGraphFactory. So let's try using it from the client. Since I restarted the server, I need to close the connection and reconnect. So I'll say remote close. And I'll look for the remote connect command. And this time I needed to be a session connection. So I'll add session to the end of the remote connect command. And this session connection, it will allow me to create a variable and use it in the following commands. And I'll need this because I'll be creating a map and putting values, key value pairs in this map. So it's much easier to do it on multiple lines instead of trying to do it all in one command on the same line. Okay, and then I'll say remote console to send the following commands to the server. And now I'll do two things. First, I'll create a template for the configured graph factory, and then I will create graphs based on this template. So to create the template, I'll first need to create a hash map that contains this template properties. So let's call our hash map templates map. Set it to a new hash map. And then, since it's a session connection, this variable will be remembered, and I can put some key value pairs in it. The key value pairs are the same as the key value pairs that you set in the properties file. So because I don't remember the key names, I'll copy them from this properties file. So for the storage backend, let's use HBase as the storage backend. And then I want to put another key value pair. I want to set the host name. So I'll copy the host name, storage.hostname key. And the value of the host name will be localhost. And these are the only two properties I want to set in my template. So now I will I will create a template using the ConfiguredGraphFactory and this template map that we just created. So I say ConfiguredGraphFactory dot, was it create template configuration, and it takes a new, let me copy this from the documentation. Okay, so ConfiguredGraphFactory.create configuration. It takes a map configuration that takes the map that we created. I'll give it the template map that we just created above. Oh no, we don't want create, we want create templates, not create configuration. Okay, that's the one we want. Create configuration is what you use when you're creating a graph based on one-time configuration. But if you want to create a template, use create template configuration instead. Okay, so where is the name of the map again? Here it is. Okay, so it's ConfiguredGraphFactory.create template configuration, and it takes a map configuration which takes a hash map. So let's execute this, and we created the template configuration successfully. Now we can create graphs based on this template configuration, and all what you will need to provide when you're creating a graph is just the graph name, and all these template properties and value will be automatically applied to any graph created by the ConfiguredGraphFactory. So now to create a graph, I'll say ConfiguredGraphFactory.create, and I'll give it the graph name. Let's call the graph Dynamic1. And it will take some time because it needs to create an HBase table. I'm still waiting on it to create the table. Okay, and it was finally created successfully. So we have a standard JanusGraph that's using HBase as a storage backend. Let's check the tables in HBase, and we have a table called Dynamic1. That's perfect. That's for the graph that we just created dynamically. And let's add another table. Let's call it Dynamic2 this time. And again, it will take a while. And it created the Dynamic2 graph. And we should see a Dynamic2 table. Here it is. Okay, perfect. And not only did it create the graphs dynamically, but it also created identifiers that can be used by the client to access the graphs, the new graphs, and the new graph traversal sources. But before I can use these identifiers, right now I'm in a session connection that was established before these identifiers were created. So I cannot use them right now. To use them, I need to close the connection and start a new connection. And in the new connection, I'll have these identifiers available for me. So I'll say remote close. And then let's look for the remote connect command. It doesn't need to be session this time. And remote console. Okay, so the variables are, or the identifiers I was talking about, one of them will be called Dynamic1. This should point to the graph object for this table, for this graph. And we also have a Dynamic1 underscore traversal. And this is the graph traversal source for the Dynamic1 graph. And we should also have a Dynamic2 because we created a graph called Dynamic2, and we should have Dynamic2 underscore traversal. for the graph traversal source for Dynamic 2 graph. Okay, so we have these available to the clients. It can be used to like add vertices, traverse the graph, whatever. Let's try adding a vertex. It's a person vertex. And then let's try counting the vertices. So you see, we were able to create graphs dynamically, and the clients are now able to use the graphs and the graph traversal sources to access these new graphs, all without needing to restart the JanusGraph server. And there are a couple of other functions of the ConfiguredGraphFactory that I'd like to show you. And the ConfiguredGraphFactory can be used to list the graph names of the graphs that it is tracking. And to do this, we use the function called getGraphNames. And it got us dynamic 1 and dynamic 2. Note that it didn't get us the other graphs that we created from the configuration, like graph and graph 2, because these two were not created or opened by the ConfiguredGraphFactory. So the ConfiguredGraphFactory doesn't know anything about them. It only knows about the graphs that it created or opened. So it only knows about dynamic 1 and dynamic 2. And another function I wanted to show you is the ConfiguredGraphFactory can be used to drop a graph. So you can say ConfiguredGraphFactory.drop and give it a graph name. Let's drop dynamic 2, for example. And it will take a while because it needs to access HBase. Okay, and dynamic 2 was finally dropped successfully. Now let's get the graph's name again, and we only have dynamic 1 now because we already dropped dynamic 2. Okay, so that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please stay tuned for more graph database videos.